Well, it is wonderful to be here. Hello. And to see some of you who attended the 2010 meeting here in Iceland. And see, I'm trying not to use glasses. I'm honored to introduce to you Ofelia García, whom I've just met, a professor emeritus at New York City College and a fighter for multilingualism and cultural literacy. She's been involved in research in these areas and written academic papers. You wouldn't think so by looking at her, but she's done this for 40 years plus. Did you realize that? The books highlighted on her website by her are 28. And I know that many people in this room use them in their classrooms. The prizes she has received for excellence in education, I'm sure, fill multiple glass cabinets. So she's something else. She's not stayed put in New York, since she has, in her career, visited and worked in places like Germany, Wales, South Africa, France, Uruguay, and Cuba. It is precisely this last mentioned which holds the key to Ofelia García's career. She herself moved from Cuba to New York at the age of 11 and has experienced on her own skin everything to do with multilingualism and cultural literacy. It evolved into helping others understand what she herself had to come to terms with. Please welcome Ofelia García.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Godan dagen. I want to start by really thanking Homfrieder for her graciousness. Over 3 years, as she said, I almost forgot that this was taking place. But I've been in many places, and I think that what really I hold dear is the relationship that we have established over all our emails and how supportive she has been and encouraging and able for me to not only visit your beautiful island, but also to bring my husband, co-author, colleague, and co-conspirator, Ricardo Tegui, who's here with me today. And I wanted to thank especially Anna, who picked us up yesterday from the airport and stopped at the Blue Lagoon, because they told me that I couldn't come here and not see it. And it is something, so wonderful to have been there. And Sigurd Borg for picking up us this morning and bringing us here. I always humbled to speak among teachers. Teachers are, I think, what has held up our world as our world fell apart during the pandemic, especially in New York City, where I have lived for 61 years now, so a long, long time. But without the teachers, we couldn't have made it. They've held our children whole. And I always have a lot of admiration for teachers and what they do every day in their classrooms. And it's almost presumptuous of me to speak to all of you who are such experts in multilingualism, coming from the United States, a place that doesn't value it. But perhaps it is because we don't value certain things that we advocate for them. So maybe that's what has made me an advocate of bilingualism. So let me just tell you what I think I want to do with you today. I want to first take you through 4 traditional language classrooms. They're not your classrooms. They're traditional language classrooms. I think sort of exemplifying the 4 different ways in which we have dealt with language education and in different contexts. So we see that there's a difference, right? So a foreign language secondary classroom, an ESL, English as a second language, elementary classroom, a bilingual early elementary classroom, and a Quechua heritage language education classroom. So I want to take you through what we usually do traditionally and what we usually teach teachers to do, and then present you with the two alternatives that I think are present today, and that is the alternative of plurilingualism and that of translanguaging. And of course, I'm going to focus on translanguaging because you're the experts on plurilingualism. But what I want to then sort of think with you about is how is it that translanguaging really transforms both the ideologies, the beliefs that we have, and the practices in these different classrooms. So then let me just take you through the first classroom. This is Monsieur Serrat, who is a typical French language teacher in a secondary classroom. And what he does is what is done traditionally, only French and only Parisian French with native pronunciation is what is required here. There's a lot of whole class instruction, some individual work, but never group work, because that would not get them where they want or where he wants them to be. And a lot of emphasis on just correction and eradication of interferences, what are seen as interferences. And teaching not language as a communicative activity, as we all do as human beings, but just bits and pieces of this Parisian French. But of course, the problem is that there are other presences and other languaging in this classroom also. Some who are not French Parisians, who are West Africans speaking French, and some who are just Germans who are at different stages of this bilingual continuum that we think can be controlled but cannot be. Then let's go to an English second language classroom, elementary classroom in Malaysia. And of course, this is Ms. Jones in a national school where there are students from different ethnic groups and typical ESL policies, only British English allowed in Malaysia, and a lot of emphasis, of course, in communication and interaction, but the following is the native English model, right? And again, the disregard for the fact that many of these Malaysians speak English in some ways, and there are other presences and languaging in these classrooms. Let me then take you to the United States, a place I know very well, and what are called dual language bilingual classrooms now. And let me just warn you that this is a term that we use in the United States so as not to mention even bilingualism. I see more and more European scholars starting to adopt dual language as a term, and I want to warn you because there is a history, a political, ideological history to the erasure of bilingualism and the naming it only as dual language that we have to be aware of. And it would take me all day to take you through that story, so I won't tell you about it. But what I will tell you is that what happens in these classrooms is that there is complete separation between one language and the other. In many of these classrooms, of course, Spanish is the major language. The United States never talks about itself as being bilingual, but certainly it is 1/4 of the population speaks Spanish. In New York City, where I live, is half of the population that speaks Spanish. But there are classrooms and schools with other languages. I recently, just last week, visited an Arabic dual language bilingual school. So there are many, but the ideology is the same. You have to separate these two languages totally. And I bring you today, maybe, if I know how to play this, because I don't see a slide. Just enter it. Okay. I bring you today a child, because I think what happens to us is, as teachers, we think of language and we forget the child that we're teaching. And this is a child who is speaking what we're going to call Spanish in a bilingual New York home, a common occurrence in New York, where Many homes speak languages other than English. It's 40 seconds, so listen carefully.
No terminé.
¿Terminaste qué? ¿Qué terminaste?
Mi journal.
¿Qué es un journal? ¿Qué es eso?
Es un mini book para estudiantes que wait. Yo quería wait también, así que mamá me compró un journal en Puerto Rico.
Ah, qué bien. ¿Y los hay en Puerto Rico?
¿Qué dijiste?
¿Hay journals en Puerto Rico?
Sí.
¿Y en Japón también hay?
You know what, we're going to play a game of bingo if anyone wants to. Oh,
So the audio wasn't great, but I think what we have to think about as scholars, as teachers, is this child who was speaking Spanish in this bilingual home. What language are these words that came up, which were the only ones that maybe you understood? Journal, reading book, right? What language is that for this child? What is the language of the home? What is this child's language, right? She has a brother named Paco. And Paco's in first grade. So she's 3 years old. She's not in school yet. But Paco is in first grade. And this is Paco's journal in first grade. And he writes, "Me at Nochebuena, for a sleepover at Abuela and Abuelo's house." So of course the problem is that this teacher, who's not aware of any bilingualism, evaluates this child as just mixing English and Spanish, and that there are words maybe that he doesn't know either in English or in Spanish. And she asks herself these questions, which are questions that have been given to us by the way that we have conceptualized language and second language acquisition. What is his first language? Is he an English language learner? Is he a native English speaker? She's confused. She doesn't know what he's doing. He is in a dual language bilingual classroom in which there's strict separation of languages. He has a teacher who does all in English, Miss Stewart, and she thinks he's deficient. She puts him in the lowest reading level, and she gives him a remedial curriculum because she thinks his problem is his Spanish. But then, the Spanish day, he has a teacher, La Señora Medina, who actually was born in Nicaragua, does not understand bilingualism, thinks of Spanish only from a monolingual perspective, but she also sees him then as deficient. She thinks that there are interferences from English and says that the problem is English. And there are consequences to this ideology, to this thinking. The consequence, of course, is failure for these children, and the idea that this child might be nilingue, neither English nor Spanish. But I think we're all smarter than that, and I think if I had the time and I would ask this room, why is it that he writes Nochebuena and not Christmas Eve? Why is it that it's Nochebuena? Anybody want to say something quickly? Yes, loud.
The family language is Spanish.
Well, but look, Nochebuena is not the same as Christmas Eve. I don't know what you do here in Iceland during Christmas Eve.
So they celebrate. The main celebration for them is not Christmas Day, but Christmas Eve.
Well, but Christmas Eve is different for him in his grandparents' home, in the other grandparents, because they're Italian. And Christmas Eve is a time in which you celebrate with family and you have 7 fishes. That's a tradition. Whereas Nochebuena is not Christmas Eve. Nochebuena is the party that we have Christmas Eve among Latin Americans, Latinos, with a lot of music, something completely different, not 7 fishes. For this child, he knows the word Christmas Eve, but it doesn't mean the same thing as Nochebuena. Just like abuelo and abuela is not his grandmother and his grandfather. Those are different people, right? So this child is using all his repertoire, all that he really knows, to make meaning of his life, whereas the teachers are only seeing the language. They're not seeing what is going on with this child. Let me take you through the fourth classroom then, and this is what is called heritage language, a word, again, that I hate because it makes us think that these are languages only from the past, when there are languages for the future, like the title of your conference. So this is what is called the heritage language classroom in a university in Peru. And this is Mr. Lopez, the teacher, and Cusi, the student, and typical policies and practices. The one word that Mr. Lopez says over and over again, the one phrase is, así no se dice. You don't say it this way, right? You don't say it this way. Continuously wanting to eradicate what he calls the interferences from Spanish. And of course, with texts that are very, very poor, because they're insufficient with regards to the Spanish text. So I want you to think about these ideologies that determine our practices sometimes when we are teaching languages. And the question that I have for all of you is, what is it that all these models of classrooms, whether we call them foreign language or second language or bilingual or heritage language, what is it that they have in common? And what they have in common is that they prepare to develop bilingualism and multilingualism, when in effect, they have monolingual strategies of policing language, the language police. They have monolingual goals of eradicating, taming the tongue, as Gloria Saldúa has taught us to say, and very monoglossic ideologies about what bilingualism is. And so what are some of these bilingual, multilingual ideologies that I think all of us have to question if we want to be inclusive of differences, as your conference today asks us to do? One of the things that is included here is that we think of named languages as being spoken only in different spaces, in different nation states, when of course the world has changed. We think of language learning as being always additive, as having a first language to which a second is added and to which a third is added. And again, those are conceptions of language that are given to us from a monolingual perspective. What is my first language? I know chronologically I learned Spanish first, but it is not the language that I speak the most. It's not the language that I use most professionally. It is, however, the language that some people identify me with. It is not the language that I identify with, right? So all of these concepts make sense if you start from a monolingual perspective, but if you really are aware of the multilingualism of the world, none of this makes sense. It's not additive. Bilingualism is not developed always sequentially. It's not, the goal is not to have two separate monolingualisms, to have two texts read by two persons in one. We were told that a long, long time ago by Grosjean. The idea that there's always has to be separation, diglossia, as my teacher Joshua Fishman taught me to say, from whom I have a great debt. He taught me everything I know about language, but he also taught me to question language, and that's what I do. Another ideology is that there has been language contact. The start of bilingualism studies, Haugen, Weinreich, were all about language contact and interferences. So that's what we're taught to think about when we teach languages. And the fact that they could be a peaceful coexistence when we know that there's a lot more at stake. So what is it that these ideologies, these beliefs about language, these political beliefs about language, or beliefs that have political consequences, as Ricardo has taught me to say. What is it that they silence? Because I think it's important not only to understand what is, but also what isn't being said. What isn't being said is the idea that language has power, and that it has been tied to colonialism, even though I've been told time and time again that this is not relevant to Europeans, which I always question, because after all, the Europeans were the inventors of colonialism, but somehow you can't speak about colonialism and Europe because there's no colonialism. Well, I think we have to really question all of this, right? And the idea given to us by the sociologist, Peruvian sociologist, Aníbal Quijano, of coloniality, the idea that even after the colonizers left, we left instruments, mechanisms in place to make differences, to oppress, to subjugate. Language, of course, being one of them, differences. Race being another one, differences. Gender being another one, differences, right? We silence the vivencia, the living that is beyond what, again, the decolonial theorist Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the abyssal line, that line that has been drawn between the powerful global north and the subjugated global south, in which we don't look beyond our own reality. We don't see beyond that line. The complex, dynamic practices of the speakers in the global south silenced. The non-white racialized speakers and the racial linguistic ideologies that make us see deficiencies and differences just because the child is not white and is racialized that way. The simultaneous language socialization that takes place in many, many homes today with our complexity and globalization. And the fact that sometimes multilingualism and bilingualism is not about being friends. It's about domination, and it's about conflict. And I think these are things that we have to be aware of, because if we are not aware of these things as we teach, we forget, right? Because everything else is coming at us from another perspective. And the other thing that these ideologies of bilingualism and multilingualism silence is the idea that there are people involved, that there are people involved with very different lives and very different languaging. And you see there that there are many other people in these classrooms that are silenced completely because the focus is on the language, not on the people we have in the classrooms. So, what is the future of languages, as your conference title asks? I think that the future of languages has to be the centering of people, the centering of speakers, and not the centering of languages. There have been recent responses to these changes, of course, plurilingualism being one, translanguaging being another one. There are commonalities in these two trends. Well, both of them emphasize the human factor in communication and language users actively using their linguistic semiotic features from their own repertoire. But I think there are also differences, and that's what I wanted to discuss with you today. So it's clear to me that plurilingualism has been a European response to make sure that there's a supranational multilingual Europe where there are plurilingual citizens, where everybody speaks two additional languages besides the first, and because it will increase mobility and integration, and of course, the neoliberal need for flexible workers and citizens. And I don't have to again remind an audience like this that there are basically two things that I think plurilingualism brought forth, which are important, and it's important for us to remember. One is the idea that languages are used to varying degrees, that there's a plurilingual competence in a repertoire of languages, and I think it also has to be acknowledged that the development of CLIL approaches have been a step forward in language education, the development of content and language integrated learning. And I think the second thing, the second value I think that plurilingualism has brought forth is this tolerance for rights. I just mentioned there the multilingual awareness projects, because I think that's something that Europeans have done really, really well. So there have been important breakthroughs. The idea that we don't have to think about balanced bilingual competence, the idea that we can leverage the first language in learning additional languages, the acknowledgement of intercultural encounters and communication, that has all been positive. I think, and I may be wrong, we have 2 days to discuss it, that plurilingualism has fallen short somehow, because it has not disrupted the abyssal thinking, it has not disrupted the colonial logic of named languages, it has not disrupted the white logic of social and linguistic facts given then as universal, that are not universal. It has not disrupted the racial linguistic ideologies with which we hear people who are different as deficient language users. I also think that there is a difference of expectations in the plurilingualism camp. And again, I may be wrong. But what I see is, for white Europeans, plurilingualism is fine, varying degree of competence to do all that we need to do. But for Black and brown refugee youth, a native degree of dominant language is important for success and for access to universities especially. So I see this as something that still troubles me, because there's something that we're not doing. So I want to introduce you then, or remind you of translanguaging, because I think it's an alternative. It pushes a little bit the plurilingualism conversation, because again, it centers people, not languages. It doesn't start from named languages, it starts from people. I'm giving you a definition that has been cited a lot from an article that Ricardo and I wrote with a colleague. Translanguaging is the deployment, and I'm emphasizing deployment because, again, it's the speakers doing it, the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without any regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named languages, that is, without the language policing that usually takes place in society and in classrooms. So what we want to think about when we talk about translanguaging is that all speakers, all of us, do language with our own unitary repertoire that we assemble, that we orchestrate. We orchestrate this network of linguistic, semiotic, multimodal features through which we make meaning of our lives, as that child did, that I showed you before, with our own knowledge systems, our own epistemologies, not someone else's, our own. And our own epistemologies are always different. So the problem in viewing language with what I'm going to call today a colonial white logic is that even though all of us as human beings have the ability to orchestrate our resources, right? Some of us are given the freedom to do so, and some speakers are not given the freedom to use many of their linguistic semiotic repertoire. And when they do, as that child did by saying Nochebuena, they're said to be deficient, right? So I think the question that all language teachers have to keep foremost in their minds is, who are those speakers that are not given the freedom to make their own meaning? Why is it that we control and police language? And why is it that language education focuses on eradicating other people's languaging rather than extending it, making it visible, and making us listen to it in a new kind of way? So how is it that we can translanguage our concept of language to teach language? We cannot focus on named language that is had. We don't have language ever. We do language, right? Yes, language done from the locus of enunciation of the speakers. That is, all students in the classroom have to take over the locus of enunciation. It has to be their language, not the other way around. And yes, resisting the racial linguistic ideologies so that we listen with different kinds of ears to these differences. And the same thing about translanguaging, the ideology of multilingualism to teach language. Again, let me just remind you that I'm saying that we're transcending all this. That's where the translanguaging comes in. It's transcending all this to teach language, not to make it disappear, but to teach it more equitably. I think in a way that is more inclusive of the differences that we see in the world today. So we're not talking about just going across two named entities, two boxes, one language and then the other. I'm not talking about code switching. It's not what translanguaging is. It's not using a first language to teach a second language. No. It's not just for intercultural purposes. What is it then? It is thinking of language as a string of pearls that we can extend to adorn ourselves in whichever way we want. Sometimes we want a long string of pearls, sometimes we want a short one, sometimes we don't want one at all. So leveraging this unitary repertoire, and I want to emphasize the idea of unitary. There has been a lot of discussion and disagreement if you follow the scholarly literature, which I sometimes don't care about too much because I think because I focus the children and I focus the teachers and I focus the classroom. So because I start there, I think when we discuss these things without focusing that, we are into something else. But you know, a lot of people are talking about multilingual translanguaging, and that leaves, to me, it leaves the concepts intact. It does not disrupt the idea of named languages. And until we do, until we change our focus, so the focus becomes the kids in the classroom and not the language per se, we're not going to be able to change much. So leveraging this unitary repertoire of speakers, inclusive of all the practices and all people, and recognizing not only our interculturality, but also our intraculturality. All of us who are bilingual, multilingual know that we also have intracultural competences and identities which are intersectional, depending on where we are, who we're with, what language we're speaking. These are all identities. Not well, we have one set identity, but there's an intersectionality between my being a woman, a mother, a grandmother, a scholar, an academic, a Cuban, an American, and a visitor to Iceland. So all of these are intersections that we deal with. So what is the design, what is it that we have to think about? In our book, The Translanguaging Classroom, which focuses the United States, because again, I think all of this has to be local. It has to emerge from the bottom. We talk about 3 different components to a translanguaging classroom. We talk about a stance, a set of beliefs that we have to have, that teachers have to have. We talk about the design. How do we design the classroom space and the instruction, and especially the assessment? We could have a long discussion about assessment. I could have done an hour only on assessment. And we talk about the shifts, the unplanned moves that we as teachers have to do. And all of us who are good teachers know that the only way to connect is if we have these shifts that are unplanned as we respond to what we call the students' translanguaging corriente, the current that's always in the classroom, that it's always not at the top, it's at the bottom, but that's where the kids are, and how do you bring that forward? So let me tell you what happens to Monsieur Seurat as he learned about translanguaging. He then makes sure that he teaches from the students up, giving the students the locus of control, thinking about all of them as emergent speakers, who are all along all points of the language continuum, in relationship to other practices, and most important, raising the students' critical consciousness about the role of language in life. Ms. Stewart and La Señora Medina, back in the United States, early elementary classroom, have a learner-centered classroom, project-based, experiential learning, lots of collaboration, using, of course, the kids' full repertoires and resources, no longer this separation. Good early childhood practices, no matter what. You cannot build good multilingual education unless you have good education first. I want to remind you that these are not strategies. Some people talk about pedagogical translanguaging as if it was a set of strategies. I talk about the translanguaging classroom, translanguaging pedagogical practices, but they're not strategies. They're opening up, trying to open up these translanguaging spaces so that students have the freedom to do language and make meaning for themselves. And I always say when teachers ask me, well, how do I know I'm not doing too much of it? Well, to me, there are 4 reasons for opening up these translanguaging spaces. 1, to scaffold the instruction. Today, you're always going to have a Polish child who arrives yesterday and now is in an Icelandic class. How do you scaffold the instruction for them? That's when translanguaging comes in. To document or assess what a student knows. How do you know that Polish student knows about, I don't know what it is that you're teaching in elementary school, fish? Is it that he doesn't know about fish, or is it that he doesn't have the vocabulary to speak about fish? To deepen understandings. If that Polish child reads a text in Icelandic, he's not going to understand much of it. But if that Polish child then has a partner with whom he can discuss the Icelandic text in Polish, that is going to deepen their understanding. And anyway, that's what we all do. I mean, when I don't understand something, I get a group of students together and I say, let's discuss this article. I don't understand a word. And that's how you deepen understandings, right? By changing the wording, changing the text to accommodate what it is that you're thinking. And I think most especially to transform individual subjectivities. And I want to focus on this because if you do translanguaging only as a scaffold, you haven't accomplished anything. What you really have to do is transform the subjectivities of deficiencies of the children that have been told that they have interferences and they're doing it wrong, and the subjectivities of superiority of those who are listening to them as superior, right? So it's the listening that we have to transform. We all have to transform the way in which we listen. So as a result of this translanguaging design, for example, Ms. Stewart and La Señora Medina changed the questions that they had about Paco. They no longer ask those questions that we talked about before. They ask about things that we really should care about. Is he engaged with the text? Is he engaged with the classroom? What is his position as he reads the text? What are his gestures? What are his emotions? What are his interests? What are the connections that he has to the text and to the classroom? I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time and I'm mindful of your time because I think it's most important what happens outside than what happens in here. But all these questions start to change. And the same thing with Mr. Lopez and Quechua. He changes the linguistic landscape. Now that tables, there are dictionaries, electronic translators on the walls. He has multilingual word walls. He groups the students. Sometimes he uses texts that are commercially produced, but as I said, those are insufficient. Many times they are texts that are locally produced because the Quechua that is being taught in schools is different because it's going back, it's pure Quechua, whereas for years, for many, many years, Quechua speakers have been speaking Quechua in contact with Spanish. So the Quechua has been transformed. So you have to be able to, of course, if you want to, extend, add another pearl, but you also have to start from the pearls that they already have, right? So the emphasis, again, is not on the text as multilingual text, but what is it that bilingual students do with text? I always say that if you're a real good teacher and the child is engaging with the text, whether it's oral or written, if the child is engaged, if the bilingual child is engaged with the text is no longer monolingual. The text might be in Icelandic, but the child is using Polish or whatever to make sense of the text. Even though you don't hear it, it's fine. But it's there, always there. And then finally, the translanguaging shifts, as I said, following the student's corriente. And again, just like I said, that multilingual translanguaging classrooms require good education practices. This also requires a different type of teacher, a teacher who's a co-learner, who becomes a co-learner with her students, and therefore gives not only the students, but herself the freedom to act according to this translanguaging corriente. So in translanguaging, languages are not in competition. You're protecting peoples and identities, and you're extending the historical and sociopolitical consciousness of the speakers and the listeners. We've always left out the listeners in language education. We have more work to do with the listeners than with the speakers. So why is it that we as a language education profession need translanguaging? Because there cannot be social justice without cognitive justice. Justice about our own understandings, questioning our understandings, so that we can really then put forth this other way of thinking about it. I'm just going to end by telling you that, just to remind you, that translanguaging is not just first language and second language. It's not code switching, it's not code mixing, it's not Franglais, it's not Spanglish, it's not any of these things that we make up. It is not the simple use of a named first language. It's not going across named languages. Again, it's not code switching, and I'm emphasizing that because people always get it wrong. And it's not a simple scaffold. Remember what I told you about transformation. They're not strategies. Now, it takes courage to do this. This is the front of my latest book on translanguaging, which is on Latino practices in the US, but it's subtitled Sin Miedo, Without Fear. It takes courage to say something different, to say what you're seeing rather than what the books are telling you that you're supposed to be doing, right? I sat in classrooms for years thinking that something was wrong. The books were telling me that the teachers were doing it this way. The teachers even said they were doing it this way, but in classrooms, something else was happening. So think without fear. What is it that you see and how you can address it? And if you want more information, the work that Ricardo and I did for the last 10 years at City University of New York, the website is there, www.cuny-nysieb.org. And I think there you have examples of more practices, videos, etc. This was a work that I take seriously. The book that we published is published by all of us, subtitled Together, Juntos, Together. And I always say, this is like the myth of Sisyphus. You push, you push, you push, you push, and then, of course, a language policy in schools brings it all back, and you continue to push. And you can only do this in a group together. You cannot do this alone, but I have every hope that in this conference there will be spaces opened for this type of thinking. Y muchísimas gracias.